Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 12-game MLB DFS slate for today on Draftkings. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like. I know it's something as small as leaving a like, but the more you guys interact with my content, leaving likes, leaving comments, and all that fun stuff, the more it's going to help me out. So I really do appreciate that. And if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be here all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players, and I cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Pennell16, CPen16 on IG. And if you want to support my content over on Patreon, it's always much appreciated. You get access to all the extra content that I put out each and every single day. And my Discord chat, we got over 300 people. So if you're interested, links in the description below. And just for example, this is my cheat sheet. I mean, I just go pretty much position by position, have my notes on each and every single player. And I have my core, my stacks, and all that fun stuff. And then I have a bunch of other tabs that are pretty interesting as well, but I'm going to bore you guys just showing you this. So if you're interested, like I said, links down below. If you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So something to keep in mind, we once again have a Coors Field slate, and last night Coors just absolutely popped off. If you did not have a lot of Coors, you probably weren't looking too good unless you absolutely just stacked up the Nats, because the Nats scored, 16 runs? I mean, they just went absolutely off versus Steven Matz. They seem to have Steven Matz numbers, because I feel like last year they scored like 20 plus runs in a Steven Matz start. And obviously not all 20 runs were against Steven Matz, but it seems like whenever Matz plays the Nats, it doesn't end too well for him. But anyway, just since this is a Coors Field slate, I'm just going to keep in mind that I'm not going to be double spending up for pitcher. I think spending over 20K at your pitcher position today is not going to be the way to go, because you don't have to play guys like Blackmon, Story, Arenado, but there's still some expensive bats that I want in my lineups today. And I'm going to most likely end up going like Scherzer with Stripling. But I wouldn't hate the idea of going Scherzer with a cheap option, or even Stripling with a cheap option if you wanted just full stack Coors. But I don't think you have to full stack it today. I think just pick your favorite spots at decent prices. But we'll start with Max Scherzer up top. He's 10,800. He is making a recent return after he left his last start early with a hamstring issue. And from what I've seen, there should be no pitch count issues, because it was just a leg injury. And I mean, if there is a pitch count issue, that would affect things. But as of right now, I searched Twitter. I searched some other sites. I didn't see anything, and so I'm going to expect him. He's going to be good to go. And when Scherzer's good to go, he is arguably a top pitcher, or not a top pitcher. He's arguably the best pitcher in baseball. Obviously, he's got some other guys to make a run for his money, like Jake DeGrom, Garrett Cole, and even Shane Bieber these days. But obviously, on the top of his game, one of the elite pitchers in the league. Vegas likes him as well. 3.67 runs against him. Slight favorite there, and 7.5 strikeouts in Vegas. If you're looking at his numbers, obviously overall elite, 35% K rate, 2.88 xFIP. Now, his one downfall is lefty power, because, look, he controls righties to the max. I mean, 38% K rate, 114 ISO given up, and only a 2% walk rate. To lefties, still over a 30% K rate, but a 191 ISO given up to lefties. So he does struggle with lefty power. It would not surprise me if someone like Michael Conforto took him deep as just a solo shot, but outside of that, I think he's going to be fine, because if he gives up like 1 or 2 runs, couple solo home runs, or whatever, and he strikes out over 10, it's not going to matter. So I definitely like Max Scherzer here. And if you're looking at his first 2 starts of the season, just disregarding the last one, he was fantastic. He had 22.5 points versus the Yankees, 32.9 points versus the Toronto Raptors, the Toronto Blue Jays, and pitch count should not be an issue here. He threw 99 pitches in his first start of the season, then he was up to 112 in his second start, and then he struck out 11 and 10. So definitely like Max Scherzer here, and I think this is a fine price tag for him. He honestly could be a guy that's over 11K, around 12K. So at 10,800, I feel pretty good about it, and so does Vegas. So definitely like Max Scherzer. If you want to pivot off of Max, who I think will end up being pretty chalky, we have Zach Wheeler at 9,900. Now, I don't love this price tag for Zach Wheeler, so this is only a GPP play, because 10K for Wheeler seems a bit much, but I do like the matchup versus the Orioles, and Vegas likes him as well. He's one of the highest favorites in the entire slate. I think he might be the highest favorite, but only 3.5 runs against them, 64% chance for the win, 5.5 strikeouts. Now, the one thing I will mention with Wheeler this year is that he's just not really been racking up the strikeouts. Through 2 starts, he only has 6 strikeouts. He struck out 4 versus the Marlins, then he had 2 strikeouts versus the Yankees, which doesn't get me too excited, because at 10K, I want some strikeouts. Like, I think he's going to be fine in the run department, but at 10K, I want some upside. I want a guy that's going to go 7 innings with 4 strikeouts. I want Max Scherzer, who might give up a home run or 2, like gives up 2 runs, but he can also get me 10 to 12 strikeouts, which is going to be way more worth it than that. So I'm siding with Max Scherzer here, but Wheeler is in a safe spot versus the Orioles, and they should be able to pick him up a win. So he's fine, but I do prefer Max. Then we have Ross Stripling, 7,900, going up against the San Diego Padres, who do struggle with right-handed pitching. Dustin May didn't have the greatest game last night. I think he finished with 9 or 11 points, somewhere around there, but he looked fine, and I do prefer the righties versus the Padres. They have a ton of good bats. You got Trent Grisham, Fernando Tatis, Manny Machado, and Will Myers, and some other guys. But they do strike out quite a bit versus righties. If you're looking at their splits last season versus righties, they're pretty on par with this season. So they got a 26.2% K rate versus righties, 89 WRC plus, 308 WOBA. They were very good versus lefties last year, but do prefer the righties versus them. And Ross Stripling has been pretty solid this season. He actually just played against the Padres, and he struck out 7 over 5.2 innings, scored 18 fantasy points. So I think he's going to be fine. He looked great in his first start versus the Giants, where he had 29.4 fantasy points. Pitch count's not going to be an issue. He went 92 pitches, 86 pitches, and 92 pitches. So I like the price tag. I think he makes a fine pairing with Scherzer in cash games. I think in cash games, most people will end up going Scherzer and Stripling because there's just not that many good mid-range options, and Stripling kind of really just stood out to me in the mid-range, and I feel like most people probably have that same thought process. Sorry, video cut out there for a second, but I don't know if I mentioned Vegas yet, but only 3.75 runs against him. 61% chance for the win, 5 strikeouts. And his numbers last season were pretty good, and they're pretty good so far this year as well. Had strong control, only 5% walk rate, 25% K rate, 3.58 xFIP. I think he's a fine option today for sure, pitching at home. And if you want some cheap options, we have Marco Gonzalez and Martin Perez, 2 lefties here. And Marco's interesting because he's going up against the Rangers, who do like to strike out versus left-handed pitching. And Marco's been good the past 2 starts. Like, really good. Kind of surprised me. I was looking through the box scores. Like, I saw Marco Gonzalez lefty versus Rangers at this price tag. I was like, yeah, that's pretty interesting. And, I just brushed up on how he's doing this season. And, 27.9 points versus the Angels. And he followed that up with another start versus the Angels where he scored 26 points. And the Angels aren't, tough out. You got plenty of good bats there. Mike Trout, Anthony Rendon, Ohtani, just a bunch of good guys. So, I'm liking this play here. He struck out 6 versus the Angels in his second start. Then he struck out 7 in his second start versus the Angels. And he had 94 pitches and 99 pitches. So pitch count's not going to be an issue here. And he's going deep into the game, 6.1 innings, 7 innings. So I think he's fine here. He's not a big strikeout guy for the most part. Only a 17% K rate last year. But I like the spot versus the Rangers. He's dirt cheap. There's a Coors Field slate. I think he is viable. Only 4.27 runs against him, which isn't too bad. He is a slight underdog. But 5 strikeouts in Vegas, and I just like the matchup. If you're looking at the Rangers splits versus lefties last year, they strike out 26.1% of the time, 91 WRC plus. Now they do have quite a bit of power, 203 ISO, but it's pretty much just a price play here, and that there's a Coors Field site. So he's really just kind of guy just to use if you want some Coors bats. Then we have Martin Perez, who also isn't the greatest pitcher in the world. He's got a low strikeout rate of 18%, but his last 2 starts, he's been usable. He really struggled in his first start of the season versus the Orioles, which is obviously a little surprising. But versus the Mets, he scored 18 points. He struck out 5. Then versus the Rays, he scored 19 points and it was on 91 pitches and struck out 4. And he gets another matchup versus the Rays, the same team he had success against. And I think he's fine. The Rays do strike out quite a bit versus lefties. We've seen that so far this season. I believe I think it was Wade LeBlanc that I forget who it was, but lefties have had some success versus them this season. If you're looking at their splits, they strike out 26% of the time versus lefties last year, 165 ISO, 99 WRC plus. I got a couple of good right-handed bats, but for the most part, I like using the Rays versus righties. They do struggle a little bit versus left-handed pitching. So Martin Perez at 6,100, he could be a guy that gets you Coors Field. Now, there's no Vegas odds out yet for this game, but I'd have to imagine the Rays aren't going to be that high up. But it wouldn't surprise me if it's around 4.5, just because Martin Perez isn't the best pitcher in the world. But this is mainly a price play just to get your Coors bats. And while I wouldn't recommend it, there's always the scenario where you could play Marco and Perez together and just play every single bat you want in the world. But just most likely, me being transparent, I'm probably going to end up going Scherzer and Stripling. But we'll see. If I need more bats, I might just drop down. But right now, the most appealing scenario to me looks like Scherzer and Stripling. Then I'll find some value Coors bats and whatnot else in my lineup. But we'll see. Now, I think that's going to be it for the pitching. We can move on to the bats now, I believe. And we'll start with catcher. And we have JT Realmuto, 5,200. And the Phillies went absolutely off last night. I forget how many runs they scored, but it was a lot. All right, I just checked. It was 13-8. That's like a football score. And that was a high-scoring game. It feels like every time I refresh Twitter, I was getting the MLB home run, the tweet that said, Phillies guy just homer. I was like, my goodness, I'm glad they weren't on the main slate. But anyway, JT Realmuto, 5,200. He's super expensive, but the Phillies are in a pretty good spot here versus Alex Cobb. Now, Alex Cobb has had some decent starts so far this season, but The bullpen sucks, and Alex Cobb, I'm going to side with the Phillies bats here. So give me some JT Realmuto. He's better versus lefties, but he's still got some fine splits versus righties over a 200 ISO. And if we're looking at Cobb's splits last season, it wasn't a big enough sample size to put too much stock into it because, look, 0% K rate to lefties, that's obviously not going to be the case. 22% K rate to righties. 676 ISO given up to righties, that's also not going to be the same. 375 ISO to lefties. But I like pretty much all the Phillies here for the most part. Alex Cobb doesn't scare me too much, even though he's had some decent starts so far this season. And Vegas would agree too. They have over a 5 implied team total. So definitely like the Phillies. Carson Kelly, 3,900. I would imagine he's going to get the start with the lefty on the mound, so no Stephen Vogt. And I definitely like righties here versus Kyle Freeland. You can use lefties as well. I wouldn't be too scared of that, but I still prefer the righties for the most part. And this is a pretty good price tag. Like the Diamondbacks, they are priced up a little more, some of these guys, but for the most part, they're still just too cheap. Like last night, I mean, the D-backs were just the most obvious plays on the slate. They were all way too cheap. Like Peralta, Calhoun, even Marte was a little cheap, and you could just easily stack up the Diamondbacks. I believe I had 5 in my cash lineup, and it was just too easy to fit in. But unfortunately, I prefer if there's a righty in the mound because that makes guys like, obviously like Calhoun, Peralta much better plays. Now against a lefty, you can't really. I mean, you could still look at some of those guys, but it just doesn't grade out as well on paper. So I do prefer the righties here. But Carson Kelly, if you're looking at his splits versus lefties last season, pretty darn good. 310 ISO, 182 WRC plus, a 356 batting average, 667 slugging. And if you're looking at Freeland splits, you're going to want righties versus him. 284 ISO given up and only a 15% K rate. So Carson Kelly, he's going to grade out as a tremendous play, and he's only 3,900. And the D-backs have a 5.58 implied team total, which is actually higher than the Rockies today because they actually have a decent pitcher on the mound, and Zach Gallen or Galen, I always forget, but he's a solid pitcher. So I do prefer the Diamondback side, and they're also cheaper. So definitely like them today. And then if you want to punt all the way down, we have Grayson Griner here at the min price at 2K, going up against the lefty and Gio Gonzalez. And if you're looking at his splits last season, obviously not a great player whatsoever for the most part. But look, 167 ISO is somewhat decent. But the rest of the numbers, a 139 batting average and a 21 WRC plus and a 34% K rate. You're playing him because he's dirt cheap. And Gio Gonzalez, he does struggle with righties. Looking at his numbers, 180 ISO, 21% K rate, and double-digit walk rate. So Griner's there if you need the absolute pump play, but hopefully you can get the Kelly for the most part. Then dropping down to first base, we have Daniel Murphy going. I'm going to say Gallen, so you guys can cringe every single time I say it if I'm mispronouncing his name. I guess I can just look it up really quick. Okay, I checked. It is Gallen, so we're good to go. I thought it was. But anyway, Gallen, he's a good pitcher. I mean, he's certainly got some upside. He's a young pitcher, but, I mean, he's been good so far to start this season. But we can use some lefties versus him, and it is Coors Field, so it does neutralize a lot of statistics. But he's got a 28% K rate to lefties last year and a 20% K rate to righties, but gave up more power to lefties, so I think we can definitely target some lefties here. 173 ISO given up, so don't mind Daniel Murphy. But for the most part, the Rockies are certainly not a must on this slate. The Diamondbacks, on the other hand, you're definitely going to want some D-backs, but the Rockies are only there for tournament options. I don't think you have to play the Rockies in cash games. Then Christian Walker, 4,600. He's got better splits versus righties than he does lefties, and he had a good game last night, as did pretty much every other Diamondback. I think besides Stephen Vogt, I don't think he did anything whatsoever. But prefer the righties here versus Kyle Freeland, and Walker's still fine versus lefties. I mean, he's better versus righties, but he's still fine versus lefties. 180 ISO, and just give me all the Diamondbacks. Highest team total on the slate, and they're also pretty cheap as well. Then Rhys Hoskins, 3,900. This is a pretty good price tag for him, going up against Alex Cobb. He's got good splits versus lefties. He's also fine versus righties. Prefer him versus lefties, though, because he only had a 215 batting average versus righties last season and 26% K rate. But I do look at the Phillies here. The Orioles pitching staff and the bullpen's just not that great. Cobb has had some decent starts this season, but for the most part, they're one of the best stacks on the slate. They have one of the higher team totals, above 5, so I do like Rhys Hoskins quite a bit. Now, C.J. Cron's also viable at first base if he plays, but he took a liner off the knee last night, so I'm not sure if he's going to play. He took himself out. He went off under his own power, I believe, but not sure if he's going to make the lineup. I've never taken a liner off the knee, so I don't know how bad that hurts, but I can't imagine it feels too great, so I can understand if he doesn't play today. But we know Miggy's going to be in the lineup at 2,400. He's dirt cheap going against a lefty and Gio Gonzalez, who does struggle with righties. And Miggy splits last season. He's not a guy that's going to come out and hit 2 home runs these days, but he had a 340 batting average versus lefties last season, over a 400 WOBA, over a 200 ISO, 154 WRC plus. He is certainly in play if you need a punt option at first base. Then dropping down to second base, we have Ketel Marte, 5,200. And again, just give me all the Diamondbacks I can get. Highest team total on the slate, and he's good versus lefties, and he's good versus righties. He's a switch hitter. And he actually has more power versus lefties as well. He had a 333 batting average versus them last season and 297 ISO, 152 WRC plus. He's great versus both sides of the plate, so it doesn't matter if they bring in a righty after Kyle Freeland or a lefty. I mean, great numbers all around. He's a low strikeout guy, 12% to lefties and 14% to righties. So Ketel Marte, if you have the dough for him, obviously one of the best plays on the entire slate. Definitely like Ketel Marte. Jonathan Scope, 4,000. So Detroit checks in as one of the better value stacks. Once again, they do tend to disappoint in these spots, but you're going to need some salary savings, and they do provide some salary savings. So Jonathan Scope here, going up against the lefty, he's definitely got some pop versus them. 286 ISO, 277 batting average, 136 WRC plus, over a 550 slugging. Does strike out quite a bit at 28%, but it's a decent home run spot for a cheap enough bet. So I think Scope's fine. And the Tigers do have a team total of 4.71 right now. And I had to imagine in my top stacks tool that they're going to grade out as the best value stack on the slate, because I believe their starting lineup salary is the lowest on the slate. I think it's like below 3,500. So they definitely grade out pretty well, especially with a team total of around 5. So definitely think the Tigers aren't playing. Now, they're not a great offense by any means, but they're in a decent spot. Then dropping down to Tommy La Stella at 3,300. Mike Fiers is not the worst pitcher in the world, but he will give up a little bit of power. Now, he's a fine pitcher. Doesn't give up a ton of strikeouts. And he actually gives up more power to righties than he does lefties. But I still think this is a viable spot for a cheap Tommy La Stella. I mean, he only had a 17% carry to lefties last season. Tommy La Stella is a pretty disciplined hitter. If you're looking at his splits last season versus righties, only an 8% strikeout rate, over a 300 batting average, 134 WRC plus, and over a 200 ISO. The team total for the Angels is 4.9, which is actually kind of highish on this slate. So I think La Stella is fine here, especially if he's going to be batting second. So don't mind Tommy La Stella at all. Then if you need a punt option, we have Danny Mendick at 2,200, and he actually had a pretty good game last night with 16 points, including a triple, and that's going to get the job done, especially when you're like this cheap. And he's 2,200, going against the lefty and Tyler Alexander. Look, his splits aren't going to look that great. He's a bottom of the lineup kind of hitter, but he's dirt cheap, and he's viable. Tyler Alexander is not someone that's going to concern me of too much, and plus the Detroit bullpen as well. And the White Sox do have a team total of 4.79 on this slate, so I do think they are viable. They're dropping down to third base. I'm just going to be playing Eduardo Escobar and moving on, just to be honest with you guys, but I did want to list a couple of other guys. Arenado's in play just because he's Arenado in Coors Field. I mean, I don't love this spot versus Gallen, but this is Coors, so literally anything goes. And they'll get to the bullpen at some point, but looking at his numbers last season versus righties, 315 batting average, only a 13% K rate. Look, it's Coors Field. You guys get the idea. Matchup kind of sucks versus Gallen, but again, that can be neutralized in this environment. But Eduardo Escobar, 3,900, he's going to be one of the top plays on the entire slate. Once again, these Diamondbacks just really didn't get as much of a price bump as they should have. He's a switch hitter, and if you're looking at splits versus lefties last season, he actually had some better numbers than compared to righties. 257 ISO, 298 batting average, only a 17% K rate, just overall better numbers all around. So Eduardo Escobar, 3,900, he's pretty much a guy you're just going to have to lock in. I'd imagine he's going to be arguably the highest owned bat on the entire slate, because third base wasn't the best position I looked at from today, and Arenado is like double the price in a tougher matchup, and you can get Escobar at the highest team total on the slate versus Kyle Freeland at only 3,900, so he makes a ton of sense to me. Then Gene Segura, if you're just using some Phillies, I don't really like this. I mean, I like the spot for him, but I prefer him versus lefties. If you're looking at splits versus righties, they were pretty horrendous last season, but he's fine just because I like the Phillies on this slate, and they have one of the higher team totals. But just to be honest, I'm playing Eduardo Escobar. There's not going to be any getting around that. Then going down to shortstop, we have Trevor Story, 6,100. He took Robbie Ray deep last night in his first at-bat. And if you guys were watching that game, I always love watching the Coors Field game. I don't know. I like the way the stadium looks. I like the announcers. I like watching the game. And he just smashed that ball. He left it inside. I think it was an inside fastball. And he just absolutely destroyed that. It went up to the concourse. But this matchup versus Gallen's not great, but Trevor Story's great versus righties, and we're in Coors Field, so he's certainly in play if you have the salary. I'm probably going to not get all the way up to Trevor Story. I mean, I wouldn't fault you for it, but he's in play if you just want to full stack the Rockies or Coors Field. Then Jorge Polanco, 4,400, going against Josh Lynn Bloom. Lynn Bloom's actually had some solid starts this season. He was great in the KBO. But I think we can use some lefties versus him, and Jorge Polanco checks in as a decent option at 4,400. Looking at splits last season versus righties, he only had a 14% K rate, 133 WRC plus, over a 300 batting average, a near 400 base percentage. He's fine. I don't love the Twins, but I think we can use a couple of these Twins lefties on this slate. But I think I might just end up going with Didi Gregorius here, 4,300. Again, it's too early in the day to make a full decision here, but I do like the spot for Didi. I like the Phillies on this slate, and he's pretty cheap, and Didi's been having a pretty good season, so might just ride the hot hand here at a decent price tag. And if you're looking at his splits versus righties, he's actually better versus lefties overall. He's a reverse splits hitter, but that doesn't mean we should shy away from him versus righties. I mean, he's been fine versus them this season. 16% K rate, 186 ISO, only an 82 WRC plus, and a 246 batting average is a little rough, but I think he's fine. I like the Phillies. He comes at a good price point as well. Tim Anderson is expected to be back in the lineup, and if that's the case, he should be leading off here versus a lefty, and he definitely makes a case as being one of the better shortstops on the slate, just for you to consider the matchup and the salary. And I always like him versus lefties. Only a 167 ISO last season, but a 326 batting average, 351 on base percentage, and a 124 WRC plus. So I certainly like Tim Anderson here. If you're looking at Alexander splits versus lefties and righties last season, prefer the righties here, but I mean, like everyone's in play, but only 19% K rate, 218 ISO given up. So, I mean, Tim Anderson's in a pretty good spot. As are all the Chicago White Sox righties, but they are pretty expensive. Like Abreu's above 5K. Yeah, I forget who else, but Edwin Encarnacion's actually cheap, or he's viable. I didn't list him on here because I didn't love the spot, but he's fine. And then Nico Goodrum, if you want to just use another Tigers righty value option versus Gio Gonzalez. If you're looking at Goodrum splits versus lefties last season, he's not a guy that's got a ton of power whatsoever, only a 155 ISO, but he had a 361 batting average versus them last season, so I certainly think he is viable. Then we'll drop down to the outfield here. We have Mike Trout, 6,100. He just continues to be the best player in baseball. It's just typical Mike Trout. And for those of you who like BVP, Mike Trout crushes Mike Fiers. He has 5 home runs versus him. I think he struck out 25% of the time, but 5 homers versus Mike Fiers. And look, Trout's got more power versus righties, and Mike Fiers gives that more power to righties. So it's a double reverse splits matchup, and I always like targeting these. So definitely like the spot for Mike Trout here. Fiers is not a terrible pitcher, but certainly will give some power, and he also isn't a high strikeout guy. And if you're looking at Trout's numbers versus righties, it's too good. 379 ISO, 682 slugging, 22% walk rate, 17% walk rate, a 303 batting average. He's obviously an elite player. I don't need to tell you that Mike Trout's a good play. It's just a matter if you have the money for him, which I'm not sure you're going to, but if you do, obviously I like him. And Charlie Blackmon, 6,000. He's one of the hottest hitters in baseball right now. Him and Mike Trout, but Blackmon's been doing really, really good. If you're just looking at the game log, it's been very good for Charlie Blackmon. He gets a matchup versus a righty in Coors Field. We do prefer lefties versus Zach Gallen, so I think Blackmon is certainly in play. So he's very expensive, and I don't think he's necessary. So don't feel like you have to just jam in a 6K with Charlie Blackmon in cash games because he's been hot and it's Coors Field. I don't think you have to. I don't think he's going to be that high owned whatsoever just because of the price tag, but I don't mind him. I mean, if you're looking at splits versus righties, obviously good numbers all around, only 15% K rate, 320 batting average, and you guys don't need to tell me that. You guys don't mean to tell you that Charlie Blackmon is a good play in Coors Field versus a righty. I mean, I think it's pretty just standard. Then David Dahl, he's the light version of Charlie Blackmon. I'm not going to just say all the same things again, but he has less power, but he's a fine play. Although it doesn't feel great paying $5,500 for David Dahl, I will say that. You know, I do prefer some of the cheaper options. Then Bryce Harper, $5,400, going with Alex Cobb. I think this is a pretty good spot for the Phillies. They're one of my favorite stacks on the slate. 5.2 implied team total. And if you're looking at the splits, he's actually better versus lefties, but that doesn't mean he's bad versus righties. He had a 255 ISO versus, or 225 ISO versus them last season. 375 on base percentage, 117 WRC plus. Only a 250 batting average on a 26% K rate, but look, Bryce Harper versus Alex Cobb, I'll give the advantage to Bryce Harper, and look, his bullpen's pretty rough, and I think he's a pretty solid option on this slate. So I don't mind Bryce Harper. He's just a little expensive. Starling Marte, 4,900, going against the lefty, and Kyle Freeland in Coors Field. Now, Starling Marte is actually a better hitter overall versus right-handed pitching, but he's got a little bit more power versus lefties, and we're in Coors Field, guys, so just load him up if you can. I definitely like Starling Marte. Now, he only had a 1% walk rate versus lefties last season, which almost looks like an error. I'd have to double-check that, but that's what it says, and I'd have to imagine that's right because I don't think everything else is wrong, but definitely like Starling Marte, 4,900. If I had to spend up for an outfielder in cash games, I'd probably end up just maxing it out at Starling Marte at 4,900 because give me all the Diamondbacks, highest team total on the slate, and going up against a pretty below-average pitcher in Kyle Freeland, who definitely gives up some power to right-handed bats. Then Max Kepler, pretty much anytime Kepler's facing a righty, he's going to make this sheet just because I'm a Max Kepler stand for the most part. 4,800, going to be leading off. He's got great numbers versus right-handed pitching. 281 ISO, only 17% K rate, so definitely like Max Kepler. Same goes for Eddie Rosario. Eddie Rosario is pretty much the same play as Kepler. He also hit a grand slam last night. Not saying he's going to do that again, but he's definitely a viable option. I know I just skipped Ohtani, which I'll talk about, but I wanted to kind of group Kepler and Rosario together. They're usually like similar price tags, which usually Rosario comes in a little bit cheaper, which I guess does make sense, but both are fine options, and they're pretty much the same exact play. Then Shohei Ohtani, 4,700. Like him anytime he's going up against a righty. He's got a 238 ISO versus righties, 127 WRC plus, a near 290 batting average. And now while Fires does give up less power to lefties, I mean, I still like Ohtani versus righties. And they actually have one of the higher team totals on the slate at 4.9. So don't mind Ohtani. Sam Hilliard should make the lineup with the righty on the mound. And Coors Field, he's only 4,300. And it's a limited sample size last season, but in a very limited time, he did crush righties. 371 ISO, 393 WOBA, 129 WC plus, 645 slugging, 26% K rate. But I don't mind Sam Hilliard if you want some cheap Coors exposure. He should end up making the lineup. Then we have Tim Lacastro, 3,700 in Coors Field. Should get a decent spot in the order because, look, Peralta, Cole Calhoun, they're lefties, so they're going to want to get some righties in the lineup, and I would assume Tim Lacastro should make it. And if you're looking at splits versus left-handed pitching last season, it's not great. He's not the best hitter in the world, but he had a 138 ISO, 225 batting average, which is not great, 354 on base percentage, but it's Coors Field, it's Kyle Freeland. You get a righty versus Kyle Freeland, especially if he's sitting high in the order, he's going to end up being a pretty good play, and there's not much value in the outfield that I like today, so if he ends up cracking it, I think he'd definitely be a good play. And then Jordan Luplow, 3,000. He's had a rough start to the season. He did homer earlier a couple of games ago, but I always like him versus lefties because if you're looking at his splits last season versus lefties, he was one of the best guys in the league versus them. He had a 422 ISO, 474 WOBA, 198 WRC plus, and just overall really, really good numbers. A 320 batting average, so I think he's in play, especially at 3K versus John Lester. Lester is not a gas can pitcher by any means, but we do prefer righties versus him. Not a high strikeout guy anymore, so don't mind Luplow. But that's going to be it for the video, guys. I hope it was helpful. If it was, remember to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. Really appreciate it. Follow me on social media if you want. Support me on Patreon. And that's going to be it. I wish you guys the best of luck. Enjoy your Tuesday and just enjoy some baseball tonight.